formally begin with the president, or? Good? Perfect. Well, we'll just get started again. Our annual review, or overview, I should say, of the budget for next calendar year. We'll talk a lot about some new challenges that have been presented with some legislation and the challenges that just come along with overseeing a growing school corporation. I do not want to go any further without thanking Brittany Robbins in my office. Been showing Brittany how to prepare the budget on Gateway as we try to develop a little bit of capacity within the office to handle these tasks as the years go in and out. And so Brittany prepared all the budget forms in Gateway for us this year, and that's where we'll ultimately submit our budget for approval through the Department of Local Government Finance. So start with the same slide that I start with every year, which is just an overview of what we're talking about when we talk about the budget. We have 3 pages worth of funds in the school corporation, but the funds that we ask for approval or appropriation for within the budget are, in our case, 6 funds. At a minimum, the school corporation is going to have an education fund, an operations fund, and then a debt service fund. Because of some circumstances within our community, we have incorporated 2 additional funds in addition to our rainy day fund, and that includes our operating referendum fund and then our referendum debt service fund. But I've listed there what ultimately is paid for from these funds, and the education fund is going to fund our teachers and our support staff. Really anything that directly impacts the education of students is technology as well, included in the education fund. Operations fund is exactly that, funding the overall operations of the district, keeping the lights on, paying for bus drivers, fuel, utilities, things like that. Operating referendum fund I often refer to as a Swiss Army knife. We shared with the community what we would use the operating referendum fund for, and that is to pay for additional teachers, pay for our SROs, defease a little bit of our utility costs, as well as some minor operational costs as well. Debt service funds are exactly for that, to service the debt that we issue and make our debt payments twice a year. Referendum debt fund is specifically for the capital referendum, paying for the renovations at our elementary schools and the construction of Central Elementary, and then the rainy day fund is for those one-time expenditures that we hope don't happen. I also like to share this early and often. Later on this evening at the board meeting, I'm going to be asking the board to pass a resolution to authorize the transfer of dollars from the education fund to the operations fund throughout the course of the 2026 calendar year. I'll explain a little bit on the next slide why it is schools have the authority to do this. We are currently advised, it's not a rule, you can go above 15%, but we are currently advised by the Department of Education that no more than 15% of the education fund support may be transferred from the education to operations fund. Again, it's not that you're disallowed from doing so, but you end up on a list and have to say so at a board meeting if you transfer more than that. The resolution that I'll ask the board to consider later this evening will state a per month amount, an up to amount. It does not mean we have to transfer that amount. In fact, many years we've not made the transfer at least 1 month. But that amount, when it is multiplied across all 12 months, will equal just under $5 million tonight from the education to the operations fund. Showing the transfer history going back to 2019 when the transfer was instituted, that corresponds with the elimination of the old general fund and the creation of the education fund on January 1st of 2019. That's a historical of what we have done. We got that down and awfully proud of that to just above 10% in 23 and 24. The reason you'll notice that is bumping back up for 2026 is due to some of the challenges that Senate Enrolled Act 1 has presented for our ability to collect property tax revenue, which supports our operations fund. A little bit of the history as to why that transfer exists. So taking that slide back that we saw earlier, back before 2019 where there was a general fund, there were items that were paid for from the general fund, which is now called the education fund, that we were told had to move to the operations fund. Those things are utilities, HR, superintendent's salary, and other items. But ultimately, what the state conceded was the expenses that we're asking you to move to the operations fund are not able to be funded with your property tax levy. And so therefore, as a school corporation, you then have the ability to transfer revenue from the education fund to the operations fund that is to represent those expenses there. There was one item that moved from what was known as the capital projects fund over into the education fund, and that is technology. But it is that forced migration of those 5 items you see at the green arrow on the bottom, really being an unfunded mandate then in the operations fund, and the revenue that traditionally serviced the operations fund was not capable of supporting those expenses. Some other school finance basics. Again, only 6 funds, but these 6 funds do encompass 91% of our spend. Our other major funds are going to be Title I, IDEA for our special education needs, but in terms of our overall expenses, 91% of our funds are encompassed in the budget that I'm referring to this evening. Another thing that's important to know is when we prepare a budget, we are sharing 2 things with the community. We are sharing with them our maximum spend in each fund. That's known as the appropriation. So we are sharing with the community right now what our maximum fund expenditures will be in each of the 6 funds, and we are not allowed to exceed that spend, even if we have the cash on hand to do so. We would have to come back later in the budget year for an additional appropriation hearing. In my time here, we've not had to do that yet. It may never happen, or it may happen this year. But we're asking and we're sharing with the community, this is how much our budgeted expenses are, and that sets our appropriation, what we are given the authority to spend. We're also sharing with the community for our property tax supported funds what our levy is going to be. What property tax levy are we going to levy or issue for that fund, and that will be the revenue that we hope to receive for that year. Notice that our cash on hand is separate from this. Just because you have the cash doesn't mean you have the authority to spend it. There are mechanisms in place where you can spend additional dollars. However, that requires an additional appropriation hearing. And again, not done that in the past 3 years, but you never know. This slide actually said 1,700 last year due to additional requirements from the state and just better accounting of where expenses are taking place. This particular budget has swelled to, I believe, 1,935 different accounts in these 6 funds when I look today. This budget spans January 1st of 2026 to December 31st of 2026. Difficult to project your expenditures. Keep in mind, we've not even settled or ratified a teacher's contract for this year. We then, depending on the contract that is ratified this year, which may be a 1 or 2 year contract, we may have another contract in force for September, October, December, November, and December of next year. So when I say 2 teacher contracts span this budget, that's what I mean. The contract that will be in force this fall and the contract that will be in force next fall, neither of which is known right now. We have we have a general idea of where that needs to be, but nothing in force. Certainly, this in some years can span a budget that's unknown. 2025 is one of those years. When the 2025 budget was being prepared, we had no idea what was going to come out of the legislative session this spring. So as we are also hearing, the budget may be opened up this spring, which is uncommon. Normally budgets run for 2 calendar years, but there is some language and some chatter that the budget may be reopened in what is normally the short session in the spring of 2026. We will ultimately submit this budget to the DLGF. We are actually statutorily obliged to submit the budget within 5 days of you all approving the budget. That always takes place at our October meeting. So we give an overview here at the August meeting. We statutorily have to hold a budget hearing, which will take place at the September board meeting. And in October, we will go ahead and present this budget for the board's approval. And I have 5 days at that point to hit submit to the DLGF. Tools that build the budget, by far and away, historical expenditures are most informative. What have we normally seen? What do we expect to see in the future? Normally with some type of increase for cost of living, some might call it CPI is another. But certainly sometimes historical expenditures aren't accurate. As a growing school corporation, we have been fairly regularly adding teachers. That, of course, would not be captured in the historical expenditures at that point. Any changes to utility spends, all things that may not necessarily be captured in historical expenditures, but do force us to be very conservative in our estimates for what our expenditures may be. Our revenue comes from the number of students that attend this school for the education fund, and so those projections are provided by the state, but certainly our demographic study that the board has authorized to take place every year, at least for the foreseeable future as our community dynamics change, those have become very informative and quite honestly very helpful. Dr. McKibben has predicted that we will have 3,698 students on October 1st this year. As of yesterday, we had 3,691. So he finalized that back in January. He's within 7 right now. So we have 2 months to gain 6 or 7 more students, and we may end up with more than that. Additional items, again, talked a little bit about staff changes, whether that be additional staffing. In this case, we added additional elementary coaches for mathematics, that each elementary shares 2 of those coaches. As I mentioned, property insurance this year was a bit of a challenge with property insurance, casualty and property. We built a new building. We built another new building in the form of the transportation department, but we sold our existing transportation department. Had we done nothing, the general trend in property and casualty insurance in the last 5 years has been roughly a 20% increase year over year, just to ensure and maintain your general liability and umbrella. I'll mention any unique one-time expenses that we're anticipating in calendar year 26. We do have one, and I'll share that with you. Preventative maintenance needs supported from the operations fund, annual replacement plans for things that we know we need to replace, equipment, things of that nature, and then, of course, our annual debt payments that we need to make for the bonds that we're issuing. Keeping track of this is not a once-a-year thing. You all receive updates to the 10-year cash flow projections every single board meeting as month-over-month actuals come in. That sheet that you received that I call the financial update is derived from a decade's worth of cash flow projections and where we perceive cash to be 10 years from now. Obviously, every year in the future, that cash flow projection is less and less accurate for what will actually happen, but certainly it's very close for next year. We speak frequently with directors of various departments. John Triller, our new director of maintenance, Becky Nichols with transportation, speaking twice per year with Bronson and technology needs. So for example, we're due for a K through 8 iPad switch over. It's been 4 years since the last time we did K through 8, and so January we'll be having those discussions, and those will likely land in March and April. I'd like to give an overview of how we did last year. When I give this presentation and share where we were in terms of appropriation, which again is our authority to spend these dollars versus where we actually ended up. It's always great when you can cruise in under where you were. Education fund, a bit of a good comfort there. Operations, it appears we spent more than we had the authority to spend. That's what that little caveat there at the bottom. You are allowed to encumber. Sometimes you'll encumber things as part of the 2023 budget, for example, and that encumbrance would happen in November. The shipping date may not be until January. Well, that item was actually part of the previous year's budget. So those are called carryover encumbrances. So it looks like we exceeded our appropriation for 2024 in the operations fund, but we had between $700,000 and $800,000 worth of carryover encumbrances from the 2023 budget. So the actual net appropriation for the operations fund of 2024 was much closer to $12.2 million in that case. Here's how we're looking so far year to date. Again, sharing the expenses thus far. It's generally fair to say that where we were through half the year in the far right-hand column could be multiplied, but in some cases, especially the education fund, There are more expenses in the second half of the year. Remember, generally we're going to give teachers raises. Generally we've had December stipends, and so the second half of the year it's a little more end-loaded. So operationally, though, I would say multiplying the operations fund by 2 is probably a bit more accurate and appropriate than the education fund. Where it's definitely more accurate is our 2 debt service funds. You make half your debt payments in June, you make half your debt payments in December. Giving a brief overview of what I believe the 2026 expenditures will be. This is what I'm budgeting for, okay? As Brittany prepared the budget and the conversations that we've had, this is how I've prepared her to plug these numbers into Gateway and ultimately give us our appropriation for 2026. Anticipate being able to give typical staff raises as in previous years. I'd love to be able to give a December stipend if able. The teacher appreciation grant is gone. That was erased with the legislative session this spring. So teachers are used to getting, and quite often we have also given our non-teachers, we've utilized cash balance to give a December stipend to all staff. TAG grant is different this year. It's not going to be paid till March, and only 20% of teachers can receive it. Would like to be able to give that December stipend again. I'd like to be able to give it in 2026. I'm prepared for utility rate and usage increases later this evening at the board meeting. If the board's so generous, I will be presenting an energy conservation project, and utility relief could be seen in the 2027 budget, but likely not the 2026 budget. Continuing to anticipate 20% property and casualty insurance increases. Continuing, again, we mentioned already how accurate Dr. McKibben is with his demographic study. Probably going to be another 2, 3, 4 teaching positions next year, budgeting for that. The one-time expense I was mentioning earlier was a conversion of a dated transportation routing software that we're still using. Would like to make that transition next year. Think of your iPhone. Some of our family members like to hold on to their iPhone for a while. And eventually it gets to a point where Apple tells you, this will no longer be updated. We are no longer supporting this. It's where we're getting with our current transportation routing software. So it's coming time to make that switch over. And then just budgeting a general 10% average increase. Would love it if it doesn't happen, but having the appropriation for it is important. The other lever that we have in our budget that is a needs-based is our debt service payments. So in 2025, this current year's budget, we are currently servicing 4 debt issuances. 5, technically. 2 separate issuances on the referendum. That's done. There's no further 2022 capital referendum issuances. We've issued the full amount on that. We're making our 20 years worth of debt payments on that. In the normal debt service fund, in 2025, we are servicing 3 issuances. 2 on the 2023 authorization to renovate LMS and build a new transportation facility, and our first issuance for cash flow on the projects here at the high school and at the old Central Elementary new preschool. Tomorrow, we'll be going to the market and issuing our next cash flow for the middle school. So from 9:30 to 11 tomorrow is going to be our open 90-minute order period for investors to invest in our bonds that we will be issuing for the next and final round of cash flow, I will say, for middle school. Transportation largely is done, obviously, at this point. So we will have 4 debt issuances to service in 2026, and that is factored in the budget. So here's a general overview of our expenses. Again, I don't include the rainy day fund in here because I don't plan for any expenses in the rainy day fund, although I do appropriate it. If we were ever to have to use rainy day dollars, that does require a resolution of the board, but it also does require appropriation. So if you were to look at our budget order, you will see an appropriation of $1 million in the rainy day fund. That allows us to eliminate one of the steps to utilize rain. I still have to come to the board for a resolution, but we would not have to hold an additional appropriation hearing to spend those dollars. So year over year, we appropriate $1 million in the rainy day fund. Never had to use it so far, but that's why you'll see that there. We know we're going to spend money in these five funds. I've also given you 4 years of historicals and just a projection of what may happen in 2026. I do like to indicate that the education fund is not property tax supported, so the gold banner at the bottom is just referencing how when we talk about our tax rate at Lebanon Community School Corporation, that is only determined from 4 funds. So just really minor expenditure slides. What I really want to spend time with the board this evening is what our revenue looks like for next year. The most sweeping changes to public school corporation revenue generation in a generation was Senate Enrolled Act 1, SB 1, when it was going through. I want to communicate to the board what this looks like for Lebanon Community School Corporation because it is very different than almost every other school corporation in the state. It will impact us. It will threaten our ability to generate revenue. But spoiler alert, because of the makeup of our community and our assessed valuation, we have been able to avoid the major obstacles that SEA 1 will present for many cities, towns, and certainly other public school corporations. So I want to walk the board through what this is going to look like for our community as we levy property taxes in the future, starting in 2026. Same exact slide as before, except instead of expenditures, we're talking revenue here, okay? So this is the revenue that we plan to generate if the plan comes to fruition. We'll start in the education fund. Education fund revenue comes from really one place, and that's the state. And by far and away, it's how many students you have enrolled in your school corporation. The gold bars represent our overall receipts. The black line represents the students. And so you notice that the line is mimicking the shape that the bar takes, and that's because revenue is generated from our students. To put this in perspective, if you focus on 2021, the enrollment growth that we've seen since 2021, and this would be October of 2021, so in a month, 5 years ago, to go from 3,306 to almost 3,700, we have added a grade level and a half. Okay, our normal graduating class from Lebanon High School since I've been here in the past 3 years has been between 250 and 290 students. In 5 years, we've added a grade level and a half, 400 students to this school corporation. The revenue then obviously corresponds with that growth. This is something that's produced by the state for us and shares our revenue in the previous fiscal year, this current fiscal year, and the fiscal year this is what's confusing about the budget process. So we're budgeting January to December of 26. Fiscal year 25-26 is June 1 of 25, July 1 of 2025 to June 30th of 2026. So these are the 12 monthly payments that we will receive. They tell us that it's an increase of almost $1.5 million and that it's a 4.78% increase. This is a function of two things. One, our increased number of students, okay, roughly the 90 that we've grown so far from last year, but also the increase in per student funding. So there was an increase in per student funding this year. Where there was one implication to school finance on the education fund side was curricular materials. Historically, we have had a separate fund, 0900, for curricular materials. And for the past 2 years, we've received a deposit from the state to support those curricular materials. Remember, there was a time where you would have fees as a parent, and you'd pay those fees, and we would receipt those fees into 0900, Fund 0900, curricular materials. 2 years ago, the state said, by far and away, parents should not be paying for school. We then turned in our curricular fees to the state, and in December, we received a deposit, which went into 0900. On December 31st of 2024, the state said, move your balance of 0900 into the education fund. And as a result of this year's legislative session, they said there is not going to be a curricular materials deposit anymore. We're just going to give it to you in the basic grant. So when they talk about a 5.97% increase to our basic grant for this school year, that has in it money that was previously appropriated elsewhere. So it looks like a large increase in our basic grant funding, but what that amount was for us was almost $600,000. So of this $1.5 million increase, that amount is in there as well. So when you tease all of that out and we go down to the bottom line, our corrected funding increase is not 1.47, it's 900,000. And the percentage increase is not 4.78, it's 2.9. Still a gracious increase, but just wanted to inform the board of some slight changes. This is what we expect to see in our cohorts this year. This is not actual students in seats. This again comes from Dr. McKibben. And again, we've heard Dr. McKibben talk a lot about indicators of growing school corporations. And if we look at the magnitude of numbers here versus what's leaving us, it generally explains the trend in student growth that we see. More young people entering, lower cohorts of seniors leaving. All right, so here's the meat of the presentation this evening, and that is Senate Enrolled Act 1. Local units of government that levy property taxes saw downward pressure on the net assessed valuation for every type of parcel shy of commercial and industrial to an extent. That's going to drive NAV, net assessed valuation, down. Therefore, to just receive the same, that has to put upward pressure on the rate due to property tax algebra. If we have a smaller pie but want the same piece of it, the rate has to be larger. That's generally what local units of government are going to see. More than likely not going to be the case for us for some reasons that I'm going to explain later. This final bullet point will not apply to us. I will explain this to the board. I will share that constraint that other school boards may be wrestling with, and it could be us sometime in the future, but it is not applicable to us, which is, it's good. This is a very busy slide, so let's attack this in pieces. Focus on the bars first. What this slide represents is our historical assessed valuation since 2020. The black bars are for the operations fund and the debt service fund, what you would call the exempt AV. The gold bar is for our operating referendum and our capital referendum, which is our non-exempt AV. The lines represent the percentage increase from the previous year, and that's going to be quantified on the right y-axis, the percentages over here. What I want to communicate to the board this evening is how different we are from the state. The red line is the state average. So these lines are what's going on in our community. These are the percentage increases in AV year over year. This is what's happening to us. This is what's happening to the state. We are consistently 8 to 10 percentage points higher in AV growth in LCSC than the state is. This looks like a gigantic plummet. This is purely the projection from our policy analytics report every year. There have been 2 counties so far that I would consider useful information for us to compare to that have released AV. Statutorily, counties have to release AV on August 1st. That has not historically happened in Boone County. There's a lot of TIF neutralization that has to take place, and we generally don't see our AV come through until late September and sometimes October. Marion County has released as of last week, and actually Hamilton County released a week prior to that. There is some interesting growth that's taking place, specifically in areas with heavy commercial and industrial, like us. So this estimate of 2% growth in the operations fund AV and debt service AV, and 4% growth in our referendum funds, I more think we're going to see this. I still think, despite the property tax initiatives instituted by the General Assembly this year, that we will see AV growth probably closer to 15% than 10%. Could be wrong, but that's what I'm anticipating. I want to talk to the board about the specific property tax relief that was instituted for each type of parcel and how that will impact our property tax base. By far and away, homeowners have received huge changes into how their deductions will take place. There will be a phase out. Senate Bill 1 is a 5-year overall plan to address property tax revenue. There will be a phase out all the way to nothing for what used to be known, and I guess still is known as a standard deduction. But a phase in, a gradual phase in, all the way to 2/3 of your home's value you will be able to deduct. In 2031, 2/3 of your home's value will be a deduction off of your gross assessed valuation. The big one is this. This was the late ad. There was a lot of press that the original iteration of Senate Bill 1 didn't do enough for property tax reform. And very late in the session, there came this $300 credit. So after all your deductions are applied, what you will see on your property tax bill is a $300 credit, additional. So in other words, they figure out your bill and then they subtract $300 from it, and that's what you pay. That $300 loss is lost revenue to the governmental entities that you pay property tax to. So historically, we have since 2009 received circuit breaker credits to the homeowners, which is lost revenue to us. There are 2 types of credit now that schools will lose: traditional circuit breaker and what we'll call the homestead credit. And I'll show in a minute what this looks like to us. When we advertise our budget to our taxpayer, we advertise what's known as Form 3. This is what I would have advertised last year. In red, I've highlighted what the DLGF has estimated our circuit breaker to be when last year's budget was made, $580,000. This is what's on our Form 3 for this year. Now, I believe that estimate to be high, but that is a $1.3 million increase to lost revenue to Lebanon Community School Corporation in all of our property tax supported funds. I believe that's high because what the DLGF does do is use last year's AVs. For reasons that I shared earlier, our AV is growing. When our AV grows, our credit drops a little bit. This is where I think we'll be. This comes from Policy Analytics. Still a significant number compared to last year's. Not the 1.8 that the DLGF is estimating, but the 1.4 is significant. What is also very noteworthy is when this bill was written, they did not protect the debt service fund. When circuit breaker was instituted, they said the debt service fund shall not bear the loss of revenue because they didn't want units of local government defaulting on bond payments. They wanted you to have cash in the debt service fund. Whether intentionally or unintentionally, that language was left out for the $300 homestead credit. So now our net homestead credit loss will be divided, not equally, but as a function of the rate of the operations fund and the debt service fund. Our operations rate will be around 1/4. Our debt service rate will be about 45 cents. So this credit actually will be more felt by the debt service fund. And so later on, when you see the appropriation for the rainy day fund, you're going to see an appropriation of not $1 million, but $2 million. Because if these credits are significant enough, it could totally wipe out our cash balance, our reserves in the debt service fund. And at that point, we have a choice. You can make debt service payments from debt service, as I just said, could run out of cash. You can make them from operations, or you can make them from rainy day. Rainy day would be my recommendation to the board. I don't know if we will exhaust all the cash in the debt service fund, but preparing the board for a conversation about making some debt payments from rainy day in 2026 due to the credit loss to the $300 homeowner credit. Our 2% parcels, this represents agriculture and non-homestead residential rentals. Okay? They received property tax relief, once again phased in over 5 years. Currently 6%, will go all the way to 33.3%. So historically, there has not been property tax relief or deductions for rental properties. They will now be able to deduct a third of their gross assessed valuation to arrive at their net assessed valuation. And there is also a change to the agricultural base rate calculation that will lower the NAV of that. So by far and away, Senate Bill 1 is the function is to lower AV, and then therefore would provide relief in a way. Again, very few opportunities for property tax relief for commercial and industrial shy of this. This one is an unknown. Business personal property. There are two things that are taxed for commercial properties. Their land and infrastructure, but their equipment. Until this year, any equipment that they own over $80,000 is subject to business personal property tax. That was elevated to $2 million. So what that means is if there was a commercial entity within our taxing districts that had $500,000 worth of machines, the first $80,000 of that would not be taxed, but the remaining $420,000 would be. Now, it's as though that company does not even own that infrastructure as of 2027, technically. Furthermore, these companies, as a part of their accounting, depreciate assets down to, they'd love to depreciate them down to zero, and you could argue that they are worthless at some point. Indiana state law, though, said you can only ever depreciate these down to 30%, and you could still tax that value of that original item that was $1 million that you've depreciated down to $300,000, but it's $300,000 forever. Now, if you bought it after January 1st of 2025, you can depreciate it all the way down to zero. So this is what we don't know what's going to happen. Is there a CFO at a commercial entity right now that's crunching the numbers to take out a business loan to replace all their equipment? Now, their tax liability is going to skyrocket because they're going to get all brand new stuff, but in 5 years they'll be able to say that's worth nothing. So this is what we don't know what's going to happen to our property tax base. Now, Zach, how big of a deal is this? Okay, well, this is what our AV is made of in Lebanon, and this is a beautiful picture. It's a diverse AV, and it's treated us very well, but it's very interesting what's going to happen to us. So we are heavy commercial and industrial. Residential, for most school corporations, is the largest part of the pie. Zionsville, for example, over 90% residential. So as you allow the mechanics of Senate Bill 1 to take place, notice what's happening and what will happen to our taxpayers. Our tax burden is going to shift to the huge industrial and commercial properties that we have in LCS. Furthermore, remember that those parcels have a cap of 3%, not 1% like residential. The majority of these parcels in Lebanon also are currently not at the cap. So all of the school corporations that are heavy residential, their rate is going to skyrocket. And when rates skyrocket, you push parcels to the cap, and at that point, there is no more revenue to extract. If our rate were to increase, whether that's our rate or any overlapping rate, Boone County's rate, City of Lebanon, Town of Whitestown, if the overall rate increases, yes, that will push residents to the cap. But what it's going to do is it's going to push the burden to industrial and commercial, and those parcels aren't at the cap. And we, for all intents and purposes, will be able to collect revenue as we have been collecting. This is the best picture in the state of Indiana for a school corporation. We have no peers. We have no peers. I don't want to present this as though there is no challenge here. But LCSC, when you run the numbers, happens to have the most beneficial AV composition when factoring in the mechanics of Senate Bill 1. There are challenges. The credit situation with the debt service fund and having to make debt payments from rainy day, I'd like to see that corrected hopefully in the spring. That's the talk of that may be corrected. But all in all, in terms of Senate Bill 1, again, there are districts where that yellow piece of pie is 30%. That's major. We have about 500 million of PPP of our $3.2 billion AV. So it's a bit, but there are a lot of school boards having a conversation about what to do with their debt service rate. Our debt service rate is low enough that the changes to kind of when you need to have a referendum don't affect us. Just know if we try to approve any new projects, which as of this moment there's not a plan to do, we would always have to go through a 30-day petition and remonstrance period because we're over that 40 cents. School corporations that are over 70 cents, however, if they wanted to do a $5 million GO to replace boilers, chillers, that's got to go on a ballot. Furthermore, referendums can only run now an even number of years in November. So there is some heavy planning that's taking place across the state about how to get a new roof. You're not doing that out of the operations fund, you're doing that with bond proceeds. But if your debt service rate is over 70, it used to be 80, but they lowered it to 70, you're going to a ballot for that. There is an emergency clause for that, so if you spring a leak, or if your chiller, if you have no air conditioning, you don't have to go through that referendum process. But I don't know what the vetting is going to be like. I'm sure there'll be some type of checks and balances for a school that's claiming, hey, this is an emergency, we can't put this on a referendum ballot. But again, I think our debt service rate is going to sit in the low 40s and just fall as the need for future debt goes away. That's what we've looked like in the past. I want to prepare the board for the real possibility. If our AV grows the way I shared earlier, we could be closer to 90 cents next year than 95. And we're at 97 this year. And that's including the debt that we're selling tomorrow, the payment for the debt that we're selling tomorrow. We could be closer to 90 cents. There's a real possibility that we end up with the lowest tax rate in Boone County. I went and grabbed the 3 schools that have more kids than us and the 3 schools just below us, and I wanted to show the board where we sit for a tax rate. This is not the best slide in the world because these are completely different parts of the state. They have completely different things going on in their school court, completely different needs of students, but these are, here's Lebanon, the 3 schools that have more kids than us, and the 3 schools just underneath us. And we sit right here. Only one other school has as many funds as we do. So we have 4 funds, and in this case have a lower tax rate than these school corporations, 3 of which only have 2 funds that are imposing a levy. But I think that's just a good comparison for schools that are very similar size to us. Here's our Boone County peers. Again, it is very possible with the upward pressure on the rate that we could flip-flop positions here for 2026. I anticipate some changes to these numbers for everybody. I don't know enough about what's going on at the other 3 schools in Boone County, but again, hearing that we have no peers and we're an anomaly where everyone else is having upward pressure on the rate and we're seeing potential drop. All All right, advertising the budget, we'll wrap this up. Form 3 is our only chance to set our maximum appropriation and levy. Statutorily, that has to be advertised 10 days before our September board meeting. I like to wait because I like to know what the actual AV is going to be. Likely won't have that, so we'll get to that 10-day limit, and I'll be advertising within 10 days of the September board meeting. As a reminder to the board, once we advertise this, it's set. Shy of having an additional appropriation hearing, we cannot adjust this. So always high, always high, always high, protect yourself. At the end of the day, we have oversight and governance to say, just because we're approved to spend this much, Zach, doesn't mean we want to. And that's kind of the approach that I take. Here's what those will be. I want to call attention to this, and that is the levy that we're going to ask for in the operating referendum fund. That is $400,000 less than this year's levy. And that's a commitment that we're going to make to the community, that when we announced a 15-cent referendum rate in 2022, our AV was nothing like what it is today. And so as that AV increases, levying 15 cents on that AV, it's more than we need. And so we're willingly levying less. We could bump that rate right back up to 15 cents next year. The General Assembly allowed the restrictions on growth in the referendum fund to expire. We could go right back to 15 cents next year in 2026. And with an almost $8 million levy in the referendum fund. We don't have $8 million of expenses. And so that's where that rate drop comes from. To put it, no. So to put that in context, with a 10% AV growth, our operating referendum rate will be right around 8 cents next year, as opposed to 15. Still going to grow cash in that fund because we want to have at least a year's worth of cash in the operating referendum fund if we have to go back out for a renewal in 2030 and no is the answer. It gives us 1 year of runoff to determine what programs and functions we will need to eliminate. I guarantee you we still need the referendum. Right now we're projected to grow $1.5 million in cash this year with a $4.9 million levy. If the referendum did not exist, we would have a structural deficit of roughly $3.5 million in calendar year 25. The operating referendum is necessary. Right-sizing the levy is prudent, however, and appropriate. And that's what that advertisement there does. Again, that's a $400,000 drop from this year's levy. So, final steps. This evening, we are going to, essentially with the board's blessing, be blessing to advertise the budget as well as the approval of the transfer from Ed to Ops. We always do that at the August meeting. Sometime between this meeting and our hearing in September, we'll post the bus replacement plan and the capital assets plan. We will have our public hearing at the September meeting. That will also be the approval of the capital assets and the bus replacement plan. And the budget itself at the October meeting. And then it's a waiting period, usually sometime in December, close to the end of the month. I'll hear from our budget rep, and she'll provide us with our 1782 notice, which is our official notice of what our tax rate and appropriations and levies will be for next year that will ultimately be finalized and incorporated with all the other Boone County units of local government and posted on the LGF website. Again, I always include, this is our final one. We've not had to do this yet, but with cash on hand and any unexpected expenditures, the need for an additional appropriation could happen this year. I don't believe it will, but just always sharing with the board that that is a mechanism that we have. Just because we lock in the appropriations doesn't mean there's not a lever to pull should something unforeseen. Questions? To this date, I have no information on what magnitude of revenue we can expect as a result of either IDD. I do know that LP1 is now officially an IDD I don't believe the Foundry is yet. I expect it to be. Certainly qualify. What they're doing there qualifies. Now, Meta does not. So Meta does not qualify as an innovative district, but certainly the Foundry and LP1, both Lilly projects, qualify. We do know that more of the land area of LP1 is in, is that Washington or Jackson Township? It's just north of Central Township. It's Webo. But now, that's just land area. If that's parking lots as opposed to vertical infrastructure, the value of that could be, but yes, we do, at this time we know that at least the majority of the land area of LP1 is actually Webo. Others?
So I'm assuming at this point, when we go back outside about how our burden has shifted to the industrial, is that just, I mean, is that just kind of a happy accident from us as a kind of district standpoint? Is that, I mean, that we just, no, at least not.
It's nothing we've done to generate that. It's what this capitalism has yielded for this lot of Boone County. There are certainly other areas of the state where there's industrial, but the lack of agriculture in terms of land area, and then just the lack of residential. I mean, it has worked out well. Now, I don't know what this looks like for other units of local government. I don't know how it applies necessarily to them. I don't know if it's the same or their constraints are different, but at least when the numbers, and again, this is all from Policy Analytics. This is the report that we pay for every year to understand what's going on in our tax base. I picked up the phone when this report was ready, when I got the call, and he said, Zach, no one is like you. Not me. No one is like Lebanon.
Business of packing up and moving out. So if Indiana does this, what's the variable is they just pack up and go to another state.
So
how would that affect?
So Mr. Haviland, what's ironic in all of this is I watched the hearing where the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee was stating that the burden of taxes needs to shift to the residents because it has historically been with industrial. But for our specific district, because of the way it's flipped, there are the majority of homeowners in the state of Indiana that will see a higher tax bill next year than this year. And I think there'll be some confusion about what happened with Senate Bill 1, because it was advertised as property tax relief. I worry the same thing. These companies in the pink and the orange, they have chief financial officers as well. And they could look at their tax bill and say, why are we staying? Now, that's a lot of infrastructure to abandon, but again, I don't know the factors that go into make those decisions, but that's an excellent point, because as I was... That could be where they keep it neutral. That could be where they keep it neutral. Yeah.
Is this anywhere now for so
So these pies are just the non-exempt AV. This is not representative of the TIF AV. That would be a different looking pie.
And it has our revenue. I mean, some of the large districts in the city of Lebanon are getting ready to roll off.
I believe the one right on Hallbaker Road is
the majority
close.
of the business park, right?
Yeah.
So we will soon be seeing more.
That should shift back into our base. Yeah. We'll reset our base, I should say. So it's going to be fluid. It's going to turn to really a levy-based scenario where used to manage tax rates a lot. City of Lebanon has had the same tax rate for a long time. You're going to see a lot of that start to shift, and it's going to move to a levy-based system. What dollar amount do you need as opposed to what tax rate do you need? Other questions? 5-minute break before the regular meeting?